Oh, Ed, I'm really happy to have you on WBAI Air again. We have been learning things from you since you had a little Peace-Eye bookstore on the Lower East Side where you and Allen Ginsberg staged peace demonstrations, pot demonstrations, and poetry events. It was like one of the places where the new culture was born. And then after we went through the Vietnam War and you had written 3 or 4 other books, I remember, I'm not sure whether it was you or someone else who wrote Shards of God. And then you wrote some kind of a book that was a parody. You were so productive. And then you started with Thule Kupferberg, the Fugs, which have been called the first authentic Lower East Side band. Ed, you've personally been a great friend to me, and maybe I should stop blowing your horn and let you, take it from here.
Well, I'm glad to be on your show again. We did it I think the first show I went on with you was 66 or 65, right when the Fugs were getting going. So it's glad to be here again.
Well, I wonder if we should start right out discussing your new book, which is, again, extraordinary, creative, poetic, historical. It's like something from the players at Hamlet's the play that Hamlet stages, where he describes himself as poetical, comical, tragical. The book is all those things. It's sad, overwhelmingly sad, and I wish you could say something about what it was to write it and what it was to live through that awful time again, when assassinations were rained down like hailstones in Kansas.
I wrote a book on the Manson family in 1970 and 71, and after that came out, I had become friends with some police officers who were homicide investigators in Los Angeles, and I learned a few things floating around about Robert Kennedy's assassination, and I had by then trained myself to write down everything I heard and to make notes and do files and put it all together. And so I began compiling information. This is over 40 years ago, and I began filling up boxes with information of interviews and stuff I'd heard from private investigator friends and from police officers, and then I located through the Committee to Investigate Assassinations, I got a copy of all the early FBI interview sheets about the Robert Kennedy assassination. Anyway, I compiled box after box, so by now I have...
And some things about the King assassination.
Yes. I also... They're somehow interconnected. The John Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and Robert Kennedy. Those assassinations are interwoven, and different intelligence agencies may have conducted them, but they are interwoven and interleaved, and they're of the same terrible tragedy that beset American history, because with the assassination of John Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and Robert Kennedy, American history was twisted and contorted and denied its real destiny by these horrible, horrible killings. And the Vietnam War, which Robert Kennedy was determined to bring to an end, went on another 5 or 6 years after his assassination, and like 20,000 more young men of the United States were killed in that war, which wouldn't have happened if Robert Kennedy had been allowed to become president. And how many millions of people in Southeast Asia were killed because of, after Robert Kennedy's assassination, the war going on. So I wrote a manifesto called Investigative Poetry based on my early researches into Manson. Because when I wrote my book on the Manson family, I wrote the first draft in line breaks in poetry form, and then I had a typist transcribe it into regular Gutenberg Bible text, but it was written in line breaks. And so A Broken Glory, the final years of Robert F. Kennedy, is written in line breaks. It's written as a giant poem, but it also quotes many, many, many different official documents, like Thomas Noguchi's autopsy report, or many pages of interviews directly quoted from FBI documents. I mean, there are 243 endnotes in Broken Glory, which tie in everything I said.
Hello?
Yeah.
People don't know who Noguchi is.
Oh, yeah. Thomas Noguchi was the coroner who autopsied Robert Kennedy and found that the bullet that killed Kennedy was shot in an upward direction 1 inch behind his right ear and entered his brain. And Sirhan, the alleged killer, was never more than 5 feet from Robert Kennedy and in the opposite direction from the back of his head. So, and there, I present information in my book that Sirhan was seen by reputable witnesses in FBI reports to seem to have been firing like a cap pistol or like blanks, and funny smells came out of his revolver and smoke as if he were firing blanks. And the real killers, there are 3 reputable witnesses who saw a second gunman. One witness, who was later a Los Angeles city attorney, told interviewers that he saw a man fire directly behind RFK and then shot into him, very near him. And there are 13 witnesses listed in my book that saw the famous woman in a polka dot dress who was coaching Sirhan and seen with Sirhan in the minutes and seconds before he shot in that terrible kitchen. Sirhan did have a .22 caliber.
And the people who said to him when he was going to exit by the usual exit, who said to him, "Come this way, Senator."
What they did, they needed to isolate Robert Kennedy. He had 3 bodyguards. One, Rosie Greer, a tackle for the Los Angeles Rams, and Rayford Johnson, an Olympic decathlon champion, and an ex-FBI agent named Bill Barry. Those were his 3 bodyguards. And he was supposed to go, he gave his speech. He won the Democratic primary in the state. He won all 178 delegates for California. And he had just received a telephone call from Mayor Daley, which seemed to Kennedy to indicate that Daley would throw his power behind RFK's race. Anyway, Kennedy was jubilant. The hotel was packed. This Ambassador Hotel was packed with thousands of people partying and singing and clapping and dancing, and they were overjoyed. So he was supposed to go off stage after he gave his speech along a certain direction. And the 3 bodyguards went in that direction to clear the path and protect him as he left. And after he gave his speech, a person behind him behind the curtain, there was a curtain on the stage, and this voice said, "This way, Mr. Kennedy." And a hand reached out, and he led him out the back, and he was alone without any protection from his bodyguards, and went into the nearby kitchen and was shaking the hands of workers. The workers of the Ambassador Hotel were very pro-Kennedy. You know, they liked what he said, and so they were trying to shake his hand. And then, boom, Sirhan came, led by the woman in the polka dot dress who nudged him and said, "Look, look, look," and pointed at Kennedy coming in through the door. And she said, "Look, look, look." And Sirhan, who had been hypnotized and programmed to shoot, thought he was firing his pistol at round targets in a rifle in a target range, and did not realize he was firing. And the real killer was right behind Kennedy, and in all the confusion fired 3 quick bullets, and one of which entered Kennedy's brain and was the bullet that killed him. Coroner Noguchi, who performed the autopsy, pulled this fatal bullet from Kennedy's brain and labeled it with a certain label. But when the bullet was introduced at the trial, the number had been changed, and it was obviously not the bullet. And my book goes into various tests that were done on the bullets in the Kennedy shooting, and they had been fudged and switched, and there's no way that...
Did they ever find the other 2 bullets?
Yes, Sirhan's gun held 8 bullets, and so they had to keep down the bullets to 8, but there were 4 people shot besides Kennedy. And there was a bullet in the ceiling and a bullet in a door jamb in the kitchen. And then there was a Polish reporter named Przanski who was covering the primary victory for a paper in Canada. And he had his tape going. And he turned over during the shooting, so he caught all the firing of all the bullets. And his tape lay untouched and unexamined for over 15 years in the California State Archive. Finally, a CNN reporter located the tape, and they did digital analysis on it, and they found out that there were 13 shots fired. So Sirhan, because of that alone, is assisted by somebody else in killing Kennedy. But the 3 witnesses that were dug up, and I cover in my book, 3 witnesses saw another person holding a revolver behind Kennedy, and one of them heard the shot from this second gunman, and that was the one that killed Kennedy.
Wow. Ed, that's so much information. I had to ask a couple of questions once or twice. I know that there are people listening who also have questions that they want to ask you, but I want to know just one thing. Do you think that the Chappaquiddick was connected?
I don't cover Chappaquiddick in my book, and there are all kinds of theories and explanations for Chappaquiddick. I think E. Howard Hunt went to Chappaquiddick right after the drowning of Mary Jo Kopechne. But
for those who don't know,
I don't know if there's any connection between any of it and Chappaquiddick. It could, and I hold my opinions in reserve because I don't have the information about Chappaquiddick, and I've never really studied it as possibly connecting to the other assassinations.
Well, I'm kind of in the field where a wild guess is enough to start other people looking. So
right. Well, they
I recommend that people check out Chappaquiddick.
Yeah. Well, it is worthy of checking out, and there are a lot of loose ends because Nixon was very interested in Chappaquiddick and sent his investigators there to look into it. And there was, evidence that Nixon's henchmen were trying to make life miserable for Kennedy in Boston, in the Boston area and in Massachusetts, because they felt that Edward Kennedy was going to run for president in 1972, and polls showed that Edward Kennedy would have beaten Nixon in the second when he ran again in 72. But by 72, Chappaquiddick and the attention it focused on Edward Kennedy knocked him out of the possibility of running. And so then the Democrats picked a relatively weak candidate, McGovern. Although his politics were great, he wasn't a great candidate, and Nixon was able to win basically a landslide.
Well, by then the dirty tricks were around. And
yeah,
they made
Watergate.
They made him cry in Massachusetts. You remember that?
As Muskie, they made Muskie. It's thought that they slipped him some a substance called BZ or another warfare chemical to make him freak out and weep. But but that was in Watergate. That's like 4 years after Robert Kennedy was assassinated. My book more or less ends with the early investigation into Robert Kennedy's death. It's over 400 pages long, and it traces...
Could you say something? By the way, this is WBAI in New York City and other programs on this Arnold network. I'm talking to Ed Sanders, who is the author of a book called Broken Glory, the story of
the final years of Robert F. Kennedy.
Yeah. I spoke to a 100-mile caller today, and he lives not too far from you in Woodstock, and he said when Trump talks about making America great, which America is he thinking of? North America, South America, Central America, Nicaragua, where the American trained police are paid for by our involuntary taxes, where they're killing hundreds of peacefully demonstrating citizens in this twisted world. Not only do we sell them the guns, but we refuse the refugees who are trying to escape from the hell that Central America is becoming. we stop them at the border and lock up their children. But I would assume to turn them into some kind of robots like the ones you talk about in your book, Ed.
Right. Well,
talk about the robots. You
call
them robos.
The United States government, beginning in the 40s and up into the early 70s, had a very, very comprehensive program to use drugs, chemicals, and techniques of hypnotism to create couriers, to create assassins that don't remember being assassins, to create people who do
Manchurian
jobs.
Candidates.
Manchurian candidates who are programmed not to remember. And part of the deal with Sirhan Sirhan is that he didn't realize for a number of years after the killing of Robert Kennedy that he was not the one who actually killed Robert Kennedy. He thought he was guilty, and then he was shown the ballistics information and the inconsistencies in the crime scene investigation and the cover-up, and he suddenly realized that he was set up and was a patsy. And so in 1972, Richard Nixon fired the head of the CIA, Richard Helms. And Richard Helms was the grandfather and the promoter of all this. I call it robo-washing, creating of programmed assassins, the creating of couriers who don't remember what they're delivering in the way of messages, and they used hospitals, and they used clinics, and they used faculties, and they used professors, and they used doctors, especially in the state of California. But when Helms was fired by Nixon, Helms sent out a directive that all the files, all the filing cabinets, all the dossiers, all the tests, all the research material for this robo-washing and for this programming of assassins was to be destroyed. And much of it was. But enough came out so that there were a series of hearings and public information outbursts given to the public in the beginning in the 1970s and going on through the 1980s on programs such as MK Ultra and other things besides MK Ultra. Many different programs in hundreds of colleges and institutions, particularly in the state of California. So Sirhan was grabbed up by this, and later an attorney, not many years ago, finally got in to hypnotize Sirhan, who's very hypnotizable, and he secured from Sirhan Sirhan for in a court filing the results of 60 hours of hypnotizing Sirhan Sirhan, who's come up and recalled pretty much everything that happened, how he was trapped in a hospital-like prison setting in 1966, and his programming began and continued through 1967 and into 1968 when he was turned loose on Robert Kennedy and fired a .22 caliber pistol generally in his direction in the kitchen of the Ambassador Hotel, while another gunman, an assassin, fired the actual killing shot that killed Kennedy.
What can you tell us about Sirhan in his, above robot existence? What did he do? And
well, he wanted to be a jockey. He was slight of build, and he took a job in 1966 in a couple of horse farms outside of Los Angeles near Corona. And in the fall of 1966, he was doing a training race at a horse farm, and he fell off his horse and injured his head. And that's when they grabbed him up. He was sent to a hospital, and he recalls under hypnosis being taken to a prison-like hospital setting where the programming of him began. And so he also recalls that he had a programmer with a foreign accent. It's believed it was a guy with an Austrian accent, but who started programming him. And Ceron remembers being a ham radio buff, and he had a ham radio in his room in his family house in Pasadena where he lived.
Was he a Muslim?
No, he was a Christian.
So
and his mother was quite religious. His mother was religious, and he himself was not very religious. But he took up ham radio, and he talks about his programming him at nighttime talking to him over a ham radio setup. And he claims that the diaries where he writes RFK must die came about because of his programmer urging him to write these diaries, these statements in notebooks during ham radio sessions in the weeks and days before the shooting of Robert Kennedy. So he was, in my view, set up and programmed and turned into a robo-washer. And then a second gunman was the one that actually killed Kennedy. And they set it up so that Kennedy was alone. They had to shoot him because if he had left California and he was off to New York City, he would have won the Democratic nomination and would have beaten Nixon very badly in the fall. So they had to get rid of him. And because he made the mistake, in my view, Robert Kennedy, of telling people, close friends, that if he were elected president, he would open up the assassination of John Kennedy and bring those who killed his brother to justice. You know, he should have probably said, look, I support the Warren Commission. Lee Harvey Oswald killed my brother. I accept it totally. But instead, he told people that, first of all, he said there were guns between him and the presidency. And secondly, he told people that when he gets in power, he will reinvestigate and bring to justice the killers of his brother. And I think that's a contributing factor to why he was killed.
Well,
and it's all contained in the 400 pages of Broken Glory. You know, I worked 40 years on this book, and every assertion in it is backed by an endnote. There's 243 endnotes. And by the way, it's very stunningly illustrated by Rick Veitch, who is an outstanding graphic artist, and he did over 100 full-page illustrations illustrating many key points of this book, including the assassination, but also the campaign and the thrill of Kennedy rising up, and he had huge crowds, even in places like Indianapolis, and huge crowds. And at University of Kansas, 14,000 students came out in a college in Kansas right after he announced. So, and then when he went to California for the first time, tens of thousands of people waited for him and followed him and sang for him, and it was a huge campaign that he was successfully running. And that's why it was so horrible when, right at his moment of triumph, they figured out a way to peel him away from his guards, from his 3 bodyguards, and he was all alone in that kitchen.
Than the other candidates put together.
Huh?
And that was a signal that he had the nomination. Daley.
Yeah, Daley called. Daley had... It's a long story told in my book, but Daley had tried to get Robert Kennedy not to run.
You should say who Daley was.
Mayor Daley was the dictatorial mayor of Chicago, and he ran he was a Democratic candidate. He was a Democrat, but he was a firm, fierce, semi-dictator in the city of Chicago. But he wielded a tremendous amount of power in the Democratic Party. And he tried to get Robert Kennedy not to run and not to oppose Lyndon Johnson. But Kennedy decided that he would oppose Lyndon Johnson. And so he rose up and he won a bunch of primaries. And when it became clear that he had won in California for 178 delegates, Daley, just before Kennedy went down to give his acceptance speech, called him and congratulated him. And Kennedy looked at his staff, and they all nodded at each other, realizing that this meant, with Daley's support, with the party boss's main supporter, with his support, that RFK would have been the nominee in Chicago. So then he went down. He spoke to John Lewis, the hero, the civil rights hero, now a congressman, but then just a civil rights hero. And he said, John Lewis, just before Kennedy went down to give his speech in the ballroom, he said Kennedy looked as happy as he ever had seen him, and he was overjoyed and smiling and relaxed. And that's when they got him.
The way you feel when you're tired and you've worked really hard and it's turned out okay.
Right.
When you're so tired that you sleep between chairs, it was
yes, sleep between chairs. And he had gone through an exhausting campaign in California. I mean, he could barely finish his final speech the night before. He campaigned all the way to the night before the primary, which was June 4th, 1968. So his campaign went to June 3rd. It ended at a hotel in San Diego, and he could barely finish. And he finally finished, and then he flew back to Los Angeles and then went out for his final night on Earth. He went out to the home of John Frankenheimer in Malibu and had with his wife and some of his children, and to have a rest. And it was from this rest he finally had, and then he took a drive into downtown L.A. John Frankenheimer himself drove him in that afternoon, and Kennedy went up to his suite, and everybody was there. Bud Schulberg and Pete Hamill and George Plimpton and all kinds of intellectuals and thinkers and philosophers. They were all there celebrating. And then he went down to give his speech, and he was peeled off from his bodyguard, left all alone, went into the kitchen, and was shot while he was alone. I mean, there were plenty of people there, but there was no one there to protect him. There were just employees of the kitchen trying to shake his hand and a few other people. But his bodyguards were trained to, knock away guns and smash down someone who would want to harm the candidate. He was all alone. And that violated the first rule of someone living in danger, is never let yourself be peeled away from your bodyguards, which is exactly what happened.
Oh, Ed, you really breaks my heart the way you talk about this, because it was, it seemed almost unstoppable. His brother's assassination had gone down the memory hole. Maybe we should take some Premagen or something that's derived from jellyfish and help our memory. But these facts that are revealed in this poetic book of yours, they're all things that I remember. Well, for the most part, they're all things I remember noticing at the time. But like it was as though people, for the most part, just like read the headlines and went on to their "I don't care" jackets. Like the president's wife, who had the miserable, selfish audacity to go down there and try to get attention away, to get a This is all like a subterfuge to take the attention away from the Mueller probe, which they're deep sixing now, because children pull at everyone's heartstrings, and someone did a Facebook fundraiser for these children who were being locked up in cages. Did you see? They raised over $5 million in like 24 hours or something, because that the politician kissing the baby is like it's like the crow on the cradle. It's just a fact of our existence, man.
Right.
Adult lives matter. Babies' lives matter. Everybody's life is matter. So I don't know, Ed. I hope you'll be willing to maybe talk a little bit more about some of the other stories. You mentioned Frankenheimer, and somebody else tells an almost identical story with one, I would say, an improvement. You know what I'm talking about?
No, not up front. Frankenheimer, of course, was the director of The Manchurian Candidate, and that's so ironic that he was waiting outside with his wife to take Robert Kennedy after his speech to a party at Sammy Davis's club. And so, to have the director of the Manchurian Candidate with whom he had stayed this final night on Earth. And it's so ironic. But I don't remember the...
I think it was somebody else who was in on that weekend, but I might be wrong. People should, if they have the book, they should look and see if I'm right or wrong. That would be interesting. I'd like to, I don't know whether you could do it, but I'd like to have you read more of the book just open it and random and
Right.
read some part of it, some sequence of events in the meticulous and poetic detail that you have in the book. And also,
Okay, I'll just open it up at random. I'm opening up. Robert Kennedy is delivering his final speech, and he congratulates Don Drysdale for a no-hit shutout that he had just pitched. And he thanks all the union supporters, and he thanks the Latinos and the blacks who had supported him, and he thanks a whole bunch of politicians and friends, and he is escorted to the stage by Doris Huerta, of the Farm Workers Union. So during his speech, Ciron was taken. They brought Ciron close. I guess they thought they wanted Ciron to try to shoot at Kennedy when he came off the stage. So he was taken by the polka-dotted dress woman to an anteroom near the stage where RFK was speaking. A professor named Dr. Daniel Brown wrote a report after 60 hours of hypnotizing Ciron, stated that Ciron was led to a room off the stage while Kennedy was giving his 10-minute victory speech. Quote, the woman in the polka-dotted dress then took Ciron by the hand and led him to the anteroom behind the stage where Senator Kennedy was speaking. There they found some coffee, and then Ciron begins to feel attracted to her. Quote, it was my job to woo her. And then all of a sudden, in the anteroom behind the stage, quote, they are interrupted by an official with a suit and clipboard. The official tells them that they cannot stay in the anteroom for security reasons. And the official then tells the girl in the polka-dotted dress to take Ciron into the kitchen. So, his final speech. He thanked his wife Ethel, thanked Rosie Greer, Rayford Johnson to great applause, and thanked the great support of black voters and the support of unions, especially thanking the United Auto Workers. He congratulated McCarthy. He pointed out that the, quote, country wants to move in a different direction. We want to deal with our own problems within our country, and we want peace in Vietnam, to which there was great applause. He said he was looking forward to, quote, a dialogue or a debate, unquote, with Hubert Humphrey, quote, on what direction we want to go in, what we are going to do in the rural areas of our country, what we are going to do with those who still suffer within the United States from hunger, and whether we're going to continue the policies that have been so unsuccessful in Vietnam, unquote. Then he finished. What I think is quite clear is that we can work together in the last analysis, and that's what has been going on within the within the United States over the period of the last 3 years, the divisions, the violence, the disenchantment with our society, the divisions, whether it's between blacks and whites, between the poor and the more affluent, or between age groups, or on the war in Vietnam, that we can start to work together. We are a great country, an unselfish country, a compassionate country, and I intend to make that my basis for running. To great applause. And then he flashed. He says, now thanks to all of you, and now it's on to Chicago, and let's win there. Thank you very much. He flashed a V sign, then left the podium. The crowd chanted, we want Bobby, we want Bobby. Behind RFK, the curtain leading back to the ramp, headed directly to the killing zone. There was a voice, quote, this way, Mr. Kennedy. unquote. First rule, don't let yourself get peeled off from your guards. His bodyguards, Olympic hero Rafer Johnson, huge L.A. Rams tackle Roosevelt Greer, started to help clear a path to Kennedy's left for RFK, his wife Ethel, and the others down the steps. But RFK was pulled back through the stages through the back of the stage. So all three of the guards prepared to clear a pathway for RFK, Ethel, and others to proceed down the steps. Instead, he was pulled back all alone to the killing zone. So Theron was backstage with the woman in the polka-dotted dress, and she was quite pretty, and he was very sexually attracted to her. You know, Theron may have been a virgin. You know, he probably never had a girlfriend, and he felt this woman was coming on to him and was possibly erotic for him. And then all of a sudden she pinched him and pointed to the door to the kitchen where they were hanging out. And she said, look, 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 look. And she pinched him and twisted at him. And he turned around and he saw a group of people coming through the kitchen door. And then he doesn't remember anything till after the shooting. And he thought that he was firing at circular targets. He had gone to the Corona police range a couple of days before, and he told the hypnotist that an officer there at the Corona police range had trained him in how to shoot people at the vital organs and kill them. So he told the hypnotist that he was shooting at circular targets in a shooting range. So he walked toward the ice machine, and somebody shot him, and he fell down in front of an ice machine, which I always thought was very symbolic, that he collapsed in front of an ice machine in a restaurant. So, and there's many, many different, I wrote this like on a 4-dimensional hologram, so from many different points of view, from different FBI witness reports, I put together a 3-dimensional, 4-dimensional, time-based history of how Kennedy was shot, and all the witnesses, especially those people who thought he might be firing a cap gun or firing a starter pistol.
I'd like to welcome WJFF in Jeffersonville, which should be joining us just about this time. I am talking, this is Bob Fass, and this is Radio Unnameable. I'm talking to Ed Sanders, who is the author of a certain kind of history called investigative poetry. And the latest and, the freshest, most wonderful example I've seen of it, wonderful, sad, terrible example of it is Broken Glory, which is available in a number of places. Ed Sanders, welcome to 1 o'clock on Radio Unnameable. I have many things I could ask you, but perhaps you'd like to go on reading sections of it.
Oh, just 1 second, please, if I may cut in. This is Bill Propp at Brooklyn. We're also being heard over at WFTE in Mount Cobb and Scranton, WIOFLP in Woodstock, and now WJFF in Jeffersonville, as well as we're streaming on WBAI.org or workforcerising.com. I think that completes it.
WBAI New York.
So, Ed.
He said that.
Well, there was a remarkable incident as Kennedy lay shot. a kitchen worker named Juan Romero. He was 17, and he was a great admirer of Kennedy. And he wanted to shake Kennedy's hand after Kennedy's speech. Romero told the FBI, "I knew he was about to leave the embassy room and that he would pass through the hallway near the kitchen. I had shaken hands with Senator Kennedy on 2 previous occasions. I took a position in the hallway just in front of the opening that leads to the kitchen. There were approximately 10 to 20 people in the hallway. Senator Kennedy came through the door accompanied by approximately 5 men. He seemed to recognize me. I was smiling, and Senator Kennedy was smiling. He held out his hand, and I shook it. Senator Kennedy kept walking for approximately 1 or 2 steps. I continued to observe him, and I noticed a man who was to my left and who was smiling and who appeared to be reaching over someone in an effort to shake Senator Kennedy's hand. At about the same time, I heard gunfire, and I noticed that this individual was holding a gun in his hand, and the gun was approximately 1 yard from Senator Kennedy's head. I observed Senator Kennedy placing his hands to his face, and he staggered backward a few steps and slumped to the floor. I immediately turned my attention completely to Senator Kennedy. I knelt on the floor at Senator Kennedy's left side, and I placed my right hand under his head and slightly lifted his head. At this time, I felt blood in my right hand. I said, "Come on, Mr. Kennedy, you can make it." His lips moved, and he seemed to say, "Is everybody all right?" I heard someone say, "Throw that gum away, Mr. Kennedy." I noticed he was chewing gum, and I started to reach for his gum, but I did not, as I did not want to put my fingers in his mouth. By then, Ethel had rushed to the scene and pushed Juan Romero away. Romero asked if he could give Bobby his rosary beads. Romero told the FBI, "I pressed them into his hand, but they wouldn't stay. So I tried wrapping them around his thumb when they were wheeling him away. I saw the rosary beads still hanging off his hand." And thus passed from in broken glory, in a field of broken glory, Robert Francis Kennedy. And Broken Glory is from Phil Oak's song, Crucifixion. The lines, "Time takes her toll, and the memory fades, but his glory is broken in the magic that he made." Time takes her toll, and the memory fades, but his glory is broken in the magic that he made. That's Phil Oak's Crucifixion. And Phil Oakes visited Robert Kennedy right around the time he was deciding to run for president. And in Kennedy's office in D.C., Phil Oakes sang Crucifixion, which Robert Kennedy realized was about his brother.
And you really painted a better picture even than the drawings in your book. The graphic art in your book is
Rick
quite amazing. It's one particular thing that I liked about it was there are famous photographs of some of these moments, but in 1 or 2 instances, Deutsch is his name, Rick Deutsch, famous comic book artist. He depicts the moment after the decisive moment that was widely circulated. So
right after they shot in Vietnam. in
That
Saigon.
was brilliant. I'd never seen that. I mean, I've seen other things that he did that were based on photographs that we've seen that were like similar, but this one was really heartbreaking as this Vietnamese police captain laughs after having shot a prisoner with his hands tied behind his back, a guy who looked like he didn't weigh 100 pounds, and then the guy like interrupted his conversation with his fellow murderers and turned around and just fired a shot through that guy's head like something from some American Western movie, which is probably where he learned it. Ed, I'm so pleased to have you on the air this morning.
Well, I'm grateful that you invited me to join you, Bob. It's a rare opportunity, and I'm honored to be called to appear on your show. You're an American hero, and I'm glad to be on your show.
Well, we'll have a little less of that later, okay? Thanks very much, but you know, there are heroes and there are heroes. And,
yeah, well,
the really heroic stuff is done by
you
people
answered
whose
the
names
call
we
of the
don't know.
age, and you did it well, and you're still doing it. So it's a long answer to a long age.
Well, there are lots of people, for instance, on BAI who know how to do this, and given a chance to talk to you, might do some things that are even more heroic. I'd love to broadcast this program that we did during the daytime and see if some of the people who really do care could, carry the word around. But this is something, again, that happened 40, 50 years ago, right?
Yep, this is just past the 50th anniversary.
Right.
They were just out now burying
the anniversary without any of this, without any of the alternative view. So what a station like WBAI does is keep the issues alive, which is the name of a song you wrote.
Right.
On a Fug's album.
Right.
You're like Frank Zappa. You're not just a brilliant artist, musician, or poet, but you're also a master of prose and are tired of the pretense that goes into this 1984 society that they're building. I'm going to shut up, Ed, and maybe let you read a little more.
This has been exhausting for me to read this. I've never read this stuff like this before, and it's very emotionally draining to me because I came over the course of the decades really to admire Robert Kennedy. I know he had an employment with Joseph McCarthy in the 50s, and I realize that. But if we don't allow people the opportunity to change, then we're twisting in the wind. And he changed, and there would have been a national health care system by now, I'm sure, if Robert Kennedy had been president, and things like a guaranteed income, and there would have been greater peace between the strata of society, and much, 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 much less warfare and less aggression on the part of the United States. Even the U.S., in my view, is a great country and a wonderful country, but it has allowed its military to take over too much.
Maybe there are some other callers. I hope you can hang on just a little bit longer and talk to some people who might be calling in. Bill?
Well, I can stay a little bit longer. I've got to.
Okay, Bill, you want to give the telephone numbers that people can call?
I'd certainly love to. The problem is, though, we have two lines. You are on one line and Ed is on the other line.
Yeah, so look, let's not take calls.
I'll get off.
No, that's all right. No. I'm pretty well wiped out from having read that section of my book, and I'm very I'm grateful to have been allowed to be on your show, but I'm kind of I've never read those sections before, and I'm a little bit scorched. But and I don't know. I've said about what I can say about my book. It tells the story in 4 dimensions, space-time tale, like a hologram of what happened to Robert Kennedy. And I try to point out some of the tragical implications of his assassination, Martin Luther King assassination, and John Kennedy's assassination that impacts the nation in which we live and which we are now. There wouldn't have been a Donald Trump if Robert Kennedy had been president. So that's my belief. So, and he wasn't a perfect guy. He had an attitude sometimes, and he was jumpy and pushy and aggressive.
But you say better a Puritan.
Yeah, better a Puritan than a sleazy, bribe-taking oligarch.
Well, Ed, thank you very much. I wish I could.
Yes, I'm glad to have been on your show.
Give you a moment or two to catch your breath, or take a walk around out in the starry universe and talk to Aeschylus and come back in. What do you say? Charles Olson would probably give you some courage.
Yeah, well, he was a mentor of mine, and I think about Charles Olson all the time. He said a writer should be like Herodotus and try to find out for himself or herself the real facts of an historical event. And that's what I've tried to do, was to find out the real facts and the real history and the real vibrancy and the real life of Robert Kennedy and what happens to him. So, anyway, thank you for the opportunity to talk about it.
Extending yourself.
It's good to hear you, Ed.
I know when you live in the country, you're a morning person.
All right. See you later.
Poets like the first rays of the sun, and God knows they're beautiful, and the birds are beautiful, and your wife Miriam, I know, has a series of articles that she published in the Woodstock Times about the birds, the descendants of the dinosaurs who have seen it all.
She's preparing a book of nature essays based on her wonderful essays in the Woodstock Journal a few years ago. So that'll be out later next year, probably. So we're designing it now, and she's getting it ready for publication. So,
thank you.
But I have a bunch of animals I got to put to bed, and so I'm a country boy, and I've got to deal with all my animals here.
What are they, if I may ask?
Well, they're various birds mainly, but also there's just a bunch of them.
we'll maybe find out some other time. Ed Sanders, thank you very much. Bill?
Yes.
Would you like to put your unpaid essence into the bill?
Well, it's hard to